Welcome everyone to the beginning of my Royal Rumble review series. 26 days, 26 Royal Rumble events to talk about. One every day between now and the 2014 Royal Rumble. So now today I kick off this series with the first ever official, anyways, Royal Rumble event that took place back on January 24th, 1988 at the Copps Coliseum in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Now, it's very striking as I go back and I watch this event again to see how much the business has changed over the years and see how much the WWF has changed now as the WWE, but see how much the Royal Rumble event itself has changed. This was the only year that the Royal Rumble had 20 participants. 20, not 30. It's an entirely different show. And you have to understand here, it's important as we go back and look at this first Royal Rumble, it's important from a historical standpoint to understand how this event even came to be. There will always be a lot of talk about Pat Patterson, it being his brainchild, and he's the one that created the event of all of that, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. Because in my opinion, the Royal Rumble to this day closely trails WrestleMania as the second most looked forward to pay-per-view in the WWE every year, period, and in professional wrestling as a whole, I feel. But this kind of goes back into the tail end of 1987, in particular November. That's when Jim Crockett Promotions, part of the NWA, was running Starrcade 87. I mean, we're going to have this big, huge show, and you had all this build up into their pay per view offering here. But Vince, and this is where I laugh when the WWF used to sit there, WWE, Vince and his cronies would sit there and complain about the tactics that Eric Bischoff used to do. Do we really want to sit there and paint the WWE and the people running the WWE as perfect angels? Because we can point to a lot of the shit that they did running the territories out of the business in the 80s and say, you want to say what Bischoff did or somebody else did was dirty. What the hell would you call what you did? Basically, what happened is Vince came up with the Survivor Series concept, and he was going to run it head to head against Starrcade. And he went to the pay per view providers at the time, the cable companies at the time, and said, "You've got options. You're either going to run my event, or you're going to run Crockett's event. Now, if you run Crockett's event, you're not going to be able to carry Survivor Series or any other WWF pay per view events in the future, including WrestleMania." When these pay-per-view providers and cable companies were, made aware of this situation, by and large, most of them said, "We're sorry, Jim Crockett. We're yanking you off, and we're going to go with Vince and the WWF because we have to. We can't afford to not have WrestleMania." So what happens? Survivor Series ends up crushing Starrcade 87, and then it carries over here into 1988. Now you've got Jim Crockett and Dusty Rhodes and his people really pissed. They're going to try and start running events in New York and up in the Northeast and in clearly established WWF territory. And they started doing this bunkhouse stampede gimmick, and it was working a little bit. So they decided, Crockett Promotions, Dusty Rhodes, the booker at the time, that they were going to actually have a bunkhouse stampede pay-per-view and have it on January 24th. Well, Vince said, you know what? Pat's got this idea. Here's what we're going to do. Where you're going to have your bunkhouse stampede on pay-per-view, we're going to go head-to-head against you on live cable television, where people don't have to pay an additional cost to watch the show. And by and large, you would have to consider it yet another stroke of genius by Vince McMahon and the WWF at the time. And it was a big boon to business, no question about it. They did. This is back in 1988, an entirely different time in terms of cable television. Frankly, before a lot of you that are watching this probably were even born. But I could tell you this much, whereas cable television exploded and grew in the 80s, it's nowhere near what it is now in 2014. The Royal Rumble ended up doing an 8.2 rating, I believe, just a little bit over 8 million viewers. And back in 1988, that was a enormously monstrous cable television number. That's still a monster cable television number to this day. That's a great number. And that's just 2014 now. Think about it back in 1988. And this is why a couple months later, Crockett's ran Clash of the Champions head-to-head against WrestleMania 4. Whereas WrestleMania 4 was on pay-per-view, Clash of the Champions was on free TV, on TBS, and that ended up doing a monster number as well. So this was the type of shit that was going on in the late 80s in the WWF. Now, as I mentioned before, now we've talked a little bit about the historical aspects and we've set the table there. It's important to know that type of stuff, I think, understanding how an event came to be. When you go back and watch this first pay-per-view, or it wasn't even a pay-per-view, excuse me, this first Royal Rumble event, which aired on the USA Network, it was a 2-hour show. You see how much the event has changed. And by and large, I'll be honest with you guys, from an entertainment standpoint, this is probably a Royal Rumble you can miss. And that's just the way it is. As far as the show itself, you kick off with Rick Rude versus Ricky Steamboat. And, that pretty much is exactly what you would expect out of a match between Rick Rude and Ricky Steamboat. They were, great scientific wrestlers, great technical wrestlers, very skilled storytellers in the ring. Their chemistry was outstanding, and this match was really damn good. If you're going to sit there and try to go head to head against an NWA Jim Crockett Promotions pay per view, and you're airing something on live television, you could do a lot worse than kicking off your show with Ricky Steamboat and Rick Rude, the match that Steamboat ended up winning via DQ. Of course, they did do something worse immediately after this by trying to have Jesse Ventura make it the biggest fucking deal in the world that Dino Bravo was trying to break the bench press world record. Oh, God, this was a train wreck. Just bad. That's all I need to say. Bang, bang, he's dead. How about that? Yeah. You had a women's tag team match. It was for the WWF Women's Tag Team Championship. Yes, they had those belts at one point in time. The Jumping Bomb Angels against the Glamour Girls, I believe it was. It was actually an okay match. And it's just funny, you go back to 1988, they had Women's Tag Team Champions. Wow. Wow. Another thing that's interesting is that the 20-man Royal Rumble, and I said 20-man, not 30-man, was the only year that they had 20-man battle royal, a 20-man Royal Rumble match. Other than the one year where they had 40, every other year's been 30. Well, this one was 20. But this match didn't even main event the show. It didn't even close out the show. That was the Islanders and the Young Stallions. Yeah, exactly. Roma and Powers versus Haku and Tama. Oof. Yeah, it was 2 out of 3 falls. You could skip out on that one too. As far as the first Rumble match itself, a couple of key things to note here. Of course, Hacksaw Jim Duggan ended up winning, and this was at a time where they were trying to build him up, I think, into like a mid-card version of Hulk Hogan in the sense that he was going to be the representation of patriotism in the United States. You had some people that he could feud with in the mid-card, and they wanted him in that role. So this made sense to have somebody, when you look back at it now, somebody like a Hacksaw Jim Duggan win this event. Now, some people might say you could have had Jake the Snake Roberts win it at this time, and that would have made a lot of sense. You could have sat there and had somebody else win it, maybe like the one-man gang, and that would have made a lot of sense. This, to me, is also important when you go back and watch it because Bret Hart was the first ever entrant into the Royal Rumble, and he ended up setting a record that year because he lasted longest. I think he went like 25 minutes. The Rumble match itself only went 33 minutes. It was that first kind of real, I think, chance for Bret Hart to kind of stand out on his own, away from the Hart Foundation, away from the Mouth of the South Jimmy Hart, away from Jim Neidhart. It was a chance for him to stand out on his own. To me, it was the beginning of planting the seed. At some point in time, this guy could be a very important singles competitor in the WWF. Now, ultimately, in terms of the importance of this show, the most important thing for Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson and everybody involved in the WWF at the time was they were using this show here on the USA Network to promote the next month's main event show, where the main event was going to be Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant in a WrestleMania 3 rematch for the WWF Championship. This is where you had the contract signing, and Andre's aligned with Ted DiBiase now. When you look back at that from a historical standpoint, it just reminds you of how much the business has changed. And for me, as a kid back then, I look back on those days and I think of those as the greatest times I ever had as a wrestling fan. I really do. It's because of stuff like that. And, you look at this event too, here, the Royal Rumble, saying the most important thing about it was pumping up and promoting the big rematch that was going to air on NBC on primetime television, on free over the air television at that. You were building up towards that This had to go off well. You had over 8 million people watch this show, and then the next month, 33 million people tuned in to watch Hogan versus Andre in the big WrestleMania 3 rematch on the February edition of Main Event back in 1988. So, depending on your perspective, if you look at wanting to watch a show and saying it had a great Rumble match and a lot of great matches, this probably isn't the show for you to go back and watch. If you're a fan of the history of professional wrestling, a fan of the history of the WWF/WWE, and you like to think about and see how things have evolved and changed over the years, and you understand how things are pieced together and how important this show is in the history of the WWE, then this is a show to go back and watch. And you sit back and you watch it and you say to yourself, man, those were some good times back then. I'm not going to sit here and grade the 88 Royal Rumble or any of these Rumbles, I don't really think. Just give you my general overall thoughts on it. Like I said, if you're one that's into the 5-star matches and great in-ring action, probably the only match you really need to watch on this show, the only thing you really need to watch on this show is Ricky Steamboat versus Rick Rude. But if you're a fan of the history of professional wrestling, you should watch the 20-man Royal Rumble and see how much the event has changed over the past 26 years. You should check out the Hogan and Andre contract signing because that's a very big, important moment in professional wrestling and WWE history. Tomorrow, I'll be reviewing the 1989 Royal Rumble, which was the first Royal Rumble offered on pay-per-view, and you ended up having 30 participants in that match. Until then, see you later.